The last thing Calla Morgan expected when she walked into that birthday party was to lose. She never played drinking games, she didn't even drink, but her best friend Anna was turning 23, and Calla, always the quiet one in the background, had promised herself she'd say yes to more things. Just for one night, just to feel alive. So when the group gathered around the coffee table and spun the bottle that determined their fate, truth or dare, Calla didn't back out. And when the dare landed on her, it came with laughter, clinking glasses, and a sentence she couldn't take back. Lose the game. Spend one day as a maid at the Tower penthouse. You know, the one with the ghost billionaire no one ever sees. It sounded ridiculous. The penthouse belonged to Julian Vale, the youngest self-made billionaire in the city. He never showed his face. Rumors said he hadn't been photographed in years. Some said he didn't exist. Some said he used doubles. Others said he fired anyone who looked him in the eye. Calla didn't care about any of that. She had no plans to actually go. But then Anna called her bluff, and then someone pulled up a sign-up link. They're hiring part-time for an art installation cleanup. One day only. You said you'd say yes tonight, Calla. So she clicked, filled out the form with shaky fingers, and pressed submit. The next morning, she was holding a clipboard and standing in the lobby of Vale Tower with a dozen other temps. She wore black slacks, a white-collared shirt, and a tight knot in her stomach. The manager read out names quickly. Assignments were handed out. Most went to the upper corporate levels, but hers? Penthouse 1. Her breath caught. I think that's a mistake. The manager didn't look up. It's on the schedule. Take the service elevator and don't touch anything unless you're told. The ride up felt like being launched into orbit. The elevator was silent. No music, no mirrored panels, just steel and soft light. When the doors opened, the entire floor was glass and marble. No reception, no security, just space, cold, beautiful, untouched. She walked in slowly, footsteps echoing. There was no art, no color, just architecture and air. It was like a modern temple built for silence. A tablet on the kitchen counter flashed instructions. Clean the glass, dust the fixtures, and replace the orchids in the guest bathroom. She followed the steps, careful not to breathe too loud. Everything was too clean already, like no one lived here, like the place was holding its breath. It was in the guest bedroom room, 3 on the map where it happened. The carpet was thick, pale. She didn't see the glass vase tipped sideways on the edge of the console table. Her elbow caught it. It slipped, shattered across the floor, in a sound too loud for such a quiet place. She dropped to her knees, frantic. The shirt she wore snagged on the cabinet corner and tore open just slightly at the side seam. The air felt too cold all of a sudden. Her hands trembled as she tried to collect the pieces, and then a voice, low, calm, not angry, but there. You don't need to bleed to say you're sorry. Calla froze. She looked up and saw him. Julian Vale. Not a myth, not a ghost. A man real tall, dressed in black, shirt sleeves rolled, barefoot on the stone floor like he'd been walking through his own absence. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. He stepped closer, looked at the blood forming at her knuckle, then, quietly, handed her a folded linen napkin. His voice was a murmur. You don't belong here. I know, she whispered, but you walked in anyway. And in that moment she didn't know if he was angry, curious, or both. All she knew was that he hadn't looked away. Calla Morgan had always lived between 2 extremes, quiet survival and invisible dreams. At 22, she had learned the art of shrinking herself to fit into spaces that never really welcomed her. She grew up in a small Pennsylvania town where nothing happened, and if it did, it usually wasn't good. Her father left when she was 7. Her mother worked nights at a nursing home and days cleaning the homes of women who pretended not to know her name. Calla knew early that no one was coming to rescue her, so she stopped waiting and started planning. Scholarships got her to New York barely. She studied part-time at a community design college, worked late at a downtown bookstore that paid just enough to make rent, and tutored high school kids in algebra for the bus fare. Her clothes were thrifted, her groceries carefully calculated, and her dreams stored in sketchbooks she rarely had time to open. She was careful, always careful, with her time, her body, her voice, especially her voice. So when she found herself in the penthouse suite of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be reachable, she didn't trust it. She didn't trust the size of the space or the silence that wrapped around every room like a warning. She didn't trust how it felt to be noticed, truly noticed by someone like him. Julian Vale, on the other hand, had grown up in the kind of life that came with marble floors and names people recognized before faces, but nothing about it felt like his. The Vale fortune had been fractured by betrayal years before Julian ever built his empire. His father, once a beloved investor and philanthropist, was ruined by business partners who took more than just assets. They took reputation, loyalty, and the belief that people could be trusted. Julian was 16 when he watched his father break without making a sound. By 20, Julian was building a company with the last of what they had left, designing software for private security networks, technology rooted in control, precision, and clean lines. It worked too well. In 5 years, Vale Systems became one of the most sought-after firms in North America, and Julian became the myth behind the code. Brilliant, elusive, emotionally unreachable. He rarely spoke to press, never appeared at parties, and hadn't dated publicly in years. The penthouse he lived in was less of a home and more of a fortress. He kept people out not because he hated them, but because he didn't know what to do with them once they got in. When Calla stepped into his space that day, bleeding slightly and apologizing without words, something in him stalled. He hadn't expected to be there. He'd canceled a Boston trip last minute, restless for reasons he couldn't name. And now here she was, shaking hands, torn uniform, eyes wide with shame and confusion. She didn't beg or cry or explain. She just looked at him like she expected to be dismissed, and for reasons he didn't understand yet, he didn't dismiss her. He handed her the linen, watched her bandage her own hand. Then he said, quietly, "You can leave through the elevator behind the kitchen." She nodded once. "I'm sorry again." He didn't answer. He just watched her walk away. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, he was reviewing security footage from the service systems, something he rarely did himself. But there she was, frozen in the frame, caught mid-motion, hair falling from her loose bun, one hand on her chest, as if she had just remembered where she was. He watched 5 seconds longer than necessary, then another 5. That afternoon, he called building operations and asked if the cleaning agency had returned the glass invoice. They had. And the girl, Calla Morgan, had already paid for the broken vase out of her own pocket. He stared at the screen. It wasn't about the money. It was the gesture. The kind of thing someone did when they assumed no one would defend them. Calla didn't expect to be called back, but a week later, her agency forwarded a special request one-day return to the Vale penthouse. She assumed it was a mistake. She hesitated, then accepted. And that's how she found herself standing in front of his door again, hands clean, nerves messy. This time he opened it himself. No tablet, no instructions, just Julian, wearing a dark shirt and the faintest frown. "You came back," he said. She nodded. "You asked?" His eyes moved over her face like he was reading something he didn't expect to understand. "You fixed the invoice." "I broke it." Most people would have lied. "I'm not most people," she said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. Then come in. No clipboard this time. She hesitated but walked inside. The air felt warmer somehow, less staged. She noticed the change immediately. One orchid had been replaced by a small potted plant, a type of fern she couldn't name. The table was no longer bare. There was a book on it, a real one, dog-eared, red. Julian watched her scan the space. "I hate when things look like no one lives in them," he said. "So why make it that way? Because when you grow up in a house where everything breaks, you start craving control." She nodded once. She understood, more than he realized. "So," she asked, "why did you ask me back?" He met her eyes then, calm but direct. "Because I wanted to see what you'd do if I did." That was the beginning. Calla didn't return to the penthouse with expectations. She told herself this was just a one-time thing, a strange echo of a dare she'd rather forget. But when Julian invited her back a third time, and then again, she stopped pretending this was accidental. The visits were never official, no work orders, no instructions. Sometimes he would simply send a message through the agency. Other times he would text her directly, brief, impersonal lines like, "Thursday, 6 p.m., or "Need your eyes on something." It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't even warmth, but it was something, and slowly it became the part of her week she anticipated the most. Their conversations were strange at first, sparse, practical. He asked her what she thought of the layout of the room. She answered plainly. He asked if the silence ever got too loud. She said yes. He didn't respond, but she saw his fingers clench slightly. Every time they spoke, it felt like they were pulling language out of water, slow, careful, deliberate. She never asked about his past. He never asked about hers. But she noticed things, like how he never checked his phone during their time together, or how he kept the temperature slightly warmer when she was there, how his voice softened, fractionally, when he said her name. One evening, she arrived late. A storm had slowed the trains, and she was drenched by the time she got to the building. Her hair stuck to her cheeks, her shoes soaked through. She almost turned back, but the elevator doors opened before she could decide. When she stepped inside the penthouse, Julian was waiting, leaning against the kitchen counter with a towel in hand. He didn't comment, just handed it to her. She mumbled thanks, pressing the towel to her face. "You didn't have to come," he said finally. She looked at him. "You asked." He paused. "Most people don't listen when I do." She didn't reply. She didn't know how. That night they didn't talk much. He made her tea. They sat across from each other near the floor-to-ceiling windows while rain streaked down the glass. At one point she asked him why he built a home so high up. He said he liked the distance. "From what?" she asked. He looked at her then, eyes unreadable. "From the noise. From the pull of people who only see what they want to take." She said nothing, but she didn't look away either, and something shifted. It was the little things that changed first. Julian began waiting by the elevator when she arrived. He offered her slippers when she took off her shoes. He asked if she'd eaten before their meetings. She never thought of these things as affection. They felt more like reflexes, like he was slowly remembering what it meant to care, without calculation. She was careful not to read too much into it, but her chest ached in strange ways when he did small things that made her feel visible. Then came the day she found the sketchbook. It was left on the edge of his study desk, open to a page she hadn't meant to show him. A figure sketch, quick lines, light shading, the faint outline of a man at a window, shoulders slumped. She had drawn it one afternoon without thinking. Julian saw it. He didn't say anything. Just traced one edge of the page and said, "You see too much." She almost apologized, but then he added, "That's why I keep asking you back." The emotional tension between them became undeniable. They never touched, but their eyes spoke more than hands ever could. She saw the way he looked at her when she didn't think he was watching, curious, cautious, and something else. Something like longing. One evening, she stayed later than usual. The city outside was glittering with the soft haze of dusk. Julian stood near the bookshelf, flipping through something old and worn. She leaned against the counter, sipping tea, her shirt slightly wrinkled from a long day. He looked up and said, "You remind me of something I forgot I needed." Her breath caught. "What's that?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, stillness, truth. She laughed gently. "You make me sound like a concept." He shook his head. "You're the only real thing in a world I built to keep everything else out." That was the first time he got close enough to touch her. He didn't, but he stood within inches. The air between them thickened. She didn't move. Neither did he. "If I crossed that line," he said quietly, "I wouldn't be able to go back." "What makes you think I'd want you to?" she whispered. The moment stretched. Then he stepped back. Not in rejection, in restraint. She respected that more than any declaration. After that night, their connection deepened. Calla started bringing little pieces of herself into his space. A notebook, a coffee sleeve with a doodle, once a broken earring she forgot on the side table. Julian didn't move any of it. He let her occupy the silence. She noticed him relaxing around her, smiling occasionally, joking very rarely. Once she caught him watching her while she read, his expression completely unguarded. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just, you're a surprise I didn't see coming." "Good or bad?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I'm still figuring that out." Then came the night she wore his shirt. Not because they had slept together, they hadn't, but because she spilled tea on hers and he offered a fresh one from his closet. It was crisp, oversized, fell to her thighs, and smelled faintly of cedar and something warmer. He looked at her for a long time when she walked out of the bathroom. She froze. "It's just a shirt." "It's not," he said quietly. That night, they sat closer on the couch, shoulders brushing, words unnecessary. She fell asleep like that, head tilted toward him, fingers relaxed on the fabric near her knee. He didn't move until morning. That became the turning point. After that, their time together wasn't just meetings or quiet talks. It was something in between, something unnamed, and every part of her heart warned her not to fall. But she was already too far gone to stop. The truth didn't come in one confession. It unfolded in fragments, like threads pulled loose from a sweater you didn't realize was unraveling. Calla never intended to ask about Julian's past, but one night, while rain painted soft lines against the windows and they sat in the hush of half-lit silence, he spoke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It started with a single sentence. "I used to think love was just another form of debt." Calla looked up from her tea, unsure if she had misheard. Julian didn't meet her eyes. He was staring at the skyline. When you grow up in a house where everything is transactional, every smile, every silence, every dinner, you start to believe affection is just leverage waiting to be used. She set her mug down slowly. "Was it your father?" He gave the faintest nod. "He taught me business before he taught me how to ride a bike, not because he wanted me to succeed, but because he needed someone to win back what he lost." He paused. "When I started my company, I promised myself I wouldn't need anyone, not investors, not partners, definitely not people who wanted access to my life." He turned to her then. "But then you walked in, uninvited, unimpressed, and you didn't ask for anything." Her throat tightened. "I didn't have anything to ask for." "That's what scared me," he said. "You weren't here for power. You weren't here for favors. You just were." From that night on, the air between them changed. Calla started to see more than the controlled CEO. She saw the man who kept emergency contact lists on paper because he didn't trust digital records. She saw how he always made 2 cups of coffee even when only one person was there. She saw the framed sketch she'd left tucked into a drawer, now standing quietly on his desk. They shared stories in whispers. Calla told him about the time her brother had a seizure in the middle of the night, and she had to call an ambulance by herself at age 15. About how she once spent 3 days eating nothing but crackers to afford her mother's medication. About how her body had never felt like hers, not from trauma, but from the weight of always using it for survival. "I've never even kissed someone," she admitted once, "not because I didn't want to, but because I was always afraid that if I gave something away, I'd lose another piece of myself." Julian's jaw tensed, not out of discomfort, but because of how much he wanted to hold that admission like something sacred. "You still have every piece," he said. "I can see them." They didn't touch, not yet, but the intimacy grew in a different way. One night, she showed him a scar on her knee from falling off her bike at 10. He traced it with his eyes, not his hands. Another night, he let her open the drawer of his desk, something no one else had ever done. She found old notebooks filled with sketched-out formulas, early business pitches, a single photo of him as a boy, smiling but stiff, beside a woman Calla guessed was his mother. "She left before I could understand why," he said simply. "So I stopped asking questions that don't have answers." "And now?" she asked. "Now I ask questions when I'm ready to hear the truth." That night, she curled up beside him on the couch, their knees brushing. They fell asleep like that, with the city glowing behind them and something warmer building quietly between their breaths. One evening, he came home late. She was already there, waiting, not in his bed, not with expectation. Just on the couch, a book in hand, one of his shirts draped loosely over her frame. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Rough day?" she asked. "Long," he said. He crossed the room, didn't stop until he was sitting beside her. She offered him the book. "It's boring," she said, "but the kind of boring that makes your heart quieter." He took it. "Then maybe I need that." She rested her head on his shoulder, and he let her. "You know," she whispered, "I don't think you forgot how to feel. I think you were just waiting for someone who didn't rush you," he exhaled slowly. "And I don't think you were ever meant to be background noise in anyone's life." They didn't speak for the next hour, just sat, breathing the same air, hearts beating slow and steady. That was the night Julian reached for her hand and didn't let go. It wasn't sexual. It wasn't even romantic in the traditional sense. It was something else. Reverent, safe, real. When she looked at him, truly looked at him, she saw a man no longer defined by power, but by choice. And she knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't temporary. Not because they said so, but because they didn't need to. It was in the way she felt safer in his silence than she ever had in anyone's promises. It was in the way he looked at her, like she wasn't just welcome in his world, she was reshaping it, without asking for permission. The line between them had always been thin, but tonight it disappeared entirely. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was just late, almost midnight, and the city outside had settled into its quiet hum. Calla was already at the penthouse, her body curled against the edge of the couch, sketchpad in her lap, one leg folded under her, Julian across from her in a button-down with the sleeves rolled and 2 undone buttons revealing the faint curve of his collarbone. The air between them buzzed, not with tension, but with the kind of electricity that builds from too many almosts. She caught him watching her again. This time, she didn't pretend not to notice. She met his gaze and held it. Something passed between them, something neither of them tried to name. "You're staring," she said softly. He didn't flinch. "So are you." She closed her sketchbook slowly, placed it on the table, and leaned forward just slightly. "Why do you keep stopping yourself?" His voice, when it came, was low. "Because once I cross that line, I won't know how to go back." "And if I don't want you to?" she asked. "Then I'll make sure you never regret it," he replied. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs. He stood, walked toward her slowly, deliberately, like every step meant something. She stood too, their bodies only inches apart now. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the tremble in her own breath. His hand lifted, paused, fingers barely brushing her jaw. "Tell me to stop," he said. She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head just enough for his palm to rest against her cheek. Her skin met his, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. He kissed her slowly, gently, as if asking a question only she could answer. She kissed him back like she already knew the answer. There was no rush, no desperation, just the slow unfolding of something that had waited too long. He pulled her closer, hands on her waist, her fingers sliding up his arms. Their bodies found each other without hesitation. He lifted her gently, carried her through the hallway to his room, the door left open behind them. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't unsure. She'd never felt more ready. In his bedroom, the light was dim, the sheets crisp, and the air warm from the heat of their breath. He unbuttoned her shirt slowly, carefully, pausing between each movement as if giving her a chance to change her mind. She didn't. When the last button slipped free, he looked at her, not at her body, but into her. She reached for him, pulled his shirt from his body and let her hands explore the skin beneath, the way his muscles moved under her touch, the way he held her like she was something breakable and sacred. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He memorized. He asked permission with every touch, and she gave it freely. Their bodies met with reverence, with patience. Her breath hitched as he kissed her neck, her shoulder, the soft curve of her stomach. His hands slid along her thighs, grounding her, guiding her, holding her when the emotion became too much to contain. She let herself fall, let herself be held, let herself be loved in a way that wasn't about performance or pleasure, but about presence. When they finally came together, it wasn't fire, it wasn't noise, it was stillness, it was breath. It was the sound of walls falling and something soft blooming in the ruins. She gasped his name. He whispered hers. And when it was over, when the sweat cooled and the silence returned, they didn't move apart. They stayed close. She rested, her head on his chest, his arm wrapped around her, anchoring her to the moment. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I didn't know I was still capable of this." "Of what?" she asked. "Of feeling this much," he answered. She lifted her head, met his gaze. "You've always been capable. You just needed the right person to make you remember." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And you're that person." She nodded. "And you're mine." He kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise. The morning came quietly. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, golden and warm. Calla stretched beneath the covers, the cotton sheets tangled around her legs, Julian still asleep beside her. She watched him for a moment, his expression peaceful in sleep, one hand resting palm up on the pillow between them. She reached out and traced his fingers lightly, committing the moment to memory. When he stirred, his eyes found hers instantly. "Still here," he said. She smiled. "Where else would I be?" He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't want to wake up alone again." "Then don't," she said. "I'm not leaving." They spent the rest of the morning wrapped in each other, not because they had nowhere else to be, but because nowhere else felt right. Later, as they shared coffee in the kitchen, Calla perched on the counter in one of his oversized shirts. He stepped between her knees and rested his hands on her hips. "This doesn't have to be temporary," he said. "I know," she replied, "but we don't have to name it yet." "No," he agreed. "Just feel it." She nodded. "And keep choosing it." He smiled, kissed her temple, and held her just a little longer. In that moment, they both knew the truth. They weren't playing anymore. They weren't dancing around tension or hiding behind routine. They had crossed the line, and neither of them wanted to go back. It started with a phone call. Julian didn't want to answer. The screen flashed with a name from a world he hadn't visited in months, a world full of polished lies, legacy expectations, and the weight of being born into money even when he'd rebuilt his own from nothing. Calla was still asleep in the other room, her hair spread across the pillow like ink. He stepped out onto the balcony, the skyline still soft with early light, and answered with a clipped hello. "It's done," the voice said. "The board voted. If you don't move forward with the Colette merger, they'll push for your resignation." Julian's jaw clenched. "That wasn't part of the agreement." "You've been distracted," the man said, careful but cold. "They don't like distractions, especially ones that come from the wrong zip code." Julian didn't respond. He ended the call, stared out at the city, and let the truth settle heavy on his chest. This wasn't about business. It was about control, about class, about the idea that love, real, raw, untamed, had no place in a world ruled by shareholders and dynasties, and it was about Calla. Later that morning, she found him at the kitchen counter, coffee untouched, staring at nothing. "You okay?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw hesitation in his eyes. "I need to tell you something." Her stomach turned. "What happened?" He told her everything. About the board, about the pressure, about the quiet threat that if he didn't play by the old rules, he'd lose everything he'd built. "And what do they want you to do?" she asked, though she already knew. He looked down. "Marry into it, merge families, businesses, bloodlines, one of their own." She nodded slowly. "Someone with the right name." He didn't deny it. "But I'm not going to do it," he said, "because it would mean giving up the only real thing I've had in years. You." Calla wanted to believe him. She wanted to stay rooted in that moment where his words felt heavier than any promise. But part of her knew how this worked, knew that when the world starts closing in, love often becomes the first thing to suffocate. "Julian, if they're willing to take everything from you just because of me—" "No," he cut in, "not because of you. Because of who I am when I'm with you, because I stop pretending." "And if you lose it all," she whispered. "Then I lose it," he said. "But I won't lose you." The problem was, he was already starting to, not because he loved her less, but because the fear around them had started to shape their choices. Meetings extended later into the night, security around the penthouse tightened. Her name began to appear in whispers behind closed doors. No headlines, not yet, but eyes followed her. Judgment trailed like smoke. One afternoon, she walked into a gallery showing and heard two women near the sculpture exhibit. "She's just a maid, isn't she? Or maybe something more temporary." The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. Calla didn't cry. She walked past them, shoulders square, eyes steady. But that night, when Julian found her curled on the bathroom floor, her breath shallow and her skin cold, he knew something had broken. "They don't see me," she said. "They see a problem you haven't solved yet." "Then they're blind," he replied. "No," she said quietly. "They're just honest about the world we're in." He lifted her chin. "You make me want to burn that world down." But the weight was growing heavier. Calla returned to work part-time, not because she needed the money, but because she needed space. The apartment started to feel too pristine again, too silent, like a life on hold. She didn't leave because of doubt. She left because of love, because she needed to know that if Julian stood up for her, it wasn't from guilt or defiance, but because he truly wanted to. She left a note on his desk. "Don't fight them for me. Fight them for you, and if you do, I'll be here." Julian read the note 3 times. He didn't call. He didn't chase her. Not immediately. Because he knew she was right, and the only way to prove what she meant was to face the storm she never asked to be part of. 3 weeks passed. He stood in boardrooms with blood in his voice. He walked out of meetings where the word legacy was used like a threat. He canceled the merger. He publicly stepped down as acting CEO. He issued a quiet statement that he was restructuring the company. Less control. More humanity. Some called it a breakdown. Some called it madness. But those who really knew Julian Rhee saw something else. Clarity. He didn't care what the world whispered about him anymore. He only cared about who he was when she looked at him. One night, Calla was sketching in her small apartment, the radio low, the city humming outside. A knock came. She opened the door to find Julian standing there, no tie, no coat, just him, real and undone and whole. He held nothing but a folded newspaper. He handed it to her. On the front page, CEO turns down merger, chooses vision over tradition. Below it, a quote. "I didn't fall in love with the future they wanted. I fell in love with the one I hadn't imagined until I met her." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "You really did it." "I had to," he said, "not because I was brave, but because I was tired of being a coward." She stepped back, letting him in. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just reached for her hand. She took it. That night, they didn't talk about what came next. They just existed, close and quiet, in the safety they had carved for each other. And in that stillness, something stronger than defiance bloomed, something permanent, not because they had promised it, but because they had earned it. Months passed, not quickly, but with purpose. The world didn't stop for them, but it softened. Julian never returned to the company in the way people expected. He launched a foundation instead, one focused on education for underprivileged youth, something his father had once dreamed of before everything collapsed. People called it redemption. He called it finally doing something that mattered. Calla didn't step into a spotlight. She didn't need to. She returned to art, not just as a hobby, but as a voice. Her first gallery showing was small, intimate, filled with sketches that told stories of resilience and quiet strength. One of the pieces showed a single hand reaching toward light, raw and open. Julian stood beside her when it sold. "That's the one that saved me," he whispered. She didn't answer. She just laced her fingers with his. They didn't move in together immediately. They didn't rush. Their lives merged slowly, like 2 rivers learning to flow side by side. She kept her apartment, but spent most nights wrapped in the rhythm of his breath. He gave her space. She gave him silence that didn't feel empty. They didn't talk about forever, but built it quietly anyway. One coffee shared at sunrise, one late-night laugh echoing through the penthouse, one gentle touch that said, "I see you, I choose you, even when it's hard." One evening, they stood on the balcony of the new home they had found together, a loft filled with light and too many books, and not enough walls. The city stretched before them, glittering like a story still being written. Calla leaned against the railing, wind in her hair. Julian stepped behind her, arms wrapping around her waist. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" he asked softly. She thought for a moment, smiled. "I think I said you were staring." He laughed, low and warm. "You were covered in paint and wearing one of my shirts like it belonged to you." She tilted her head back to rest against his chest. That was the night I stopped trying to be someone else, the night I let myself be seen. And the night I remembered how to feel, he said, because you didn't try to fix me. You just stayed. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. That's what love is, isn't it? Not the grand gestures, but the quiet choices, the staying. He kissed her forehead, the choosing, again and again. Their story didn't begin in perfection. It began in a mistake, in a moment of vulnerability wrapped in silk and fear and the chaos of firsts. But what followed wasn't shame or scandal. It was the slow, steady construction of something real. Something that defied the noise and the past and the world's expectations. Calla had once believed that love was something reserved for the lucky. Julian had once believed it was something people used against you. But, together, they discovered it was neither. It was a choice, a risk, a truth. As the city breathed around them, as the stars flickered against the skyline, he whispered the words he had never dared say before. I love you, Calla. Not because you saved me, but because you reminded me I was worth saving. She held him tighter. I love you because you never asked me to be anyone but myself. And in that moment, wrapped in the warmth of everything they had built from nothing, they understood that love wasn't about being untouched or unscarred. It was about being seen, chosen, and held exactly as you are.